Okay, this is in the December 1935 preface. And I just thought it's a nice little introduction. It was referring, of course, to his somewhat breach with classical theory. And as another introductory idea, I've done a lot of study in the last several years in social psychology, and because I've been trying to work out, in the wake of the global financial crisis, how the hell haven't we had a major breach in macroeconomics of a similar type that we had in the mid-70s, given the poverty of the mainstream approach which was exposed by the global financial crisis. And so that led me into trying to understand that in social psychology. And a really interesting example of this groupthink phenomenon, which is the way groups become patterned in their behaviour, and insular and in denial and mob rule and all the rest of it, which is incredibly descriptive of the economics profession, is this character Joseph Altman, who was a US biologist. And he was the first person to really talk about neurogenesis. And neurogenesis is this idea that adults can rebuild their brain cells. And that was extremely challenging for the perceived wisdom of the day. And of course it was because the area of research was very small, there was sort of like a mafia operating, and the dominant researcher at the time was really challenged by this idea, and Altman was basically vilified. And his research was suppressed by the group dynamics that was operating in this area of human biology. And it wasn't only in 1999 this woman, Elizabeth Gould, so-called rediscovered the idea. And of course now it's the dominant paradigm in that area. And this example is one of many to describe the way in which new ideas that challenge the mainstream are suppressed. And I just want to talk a bit about that today. And this leads to a sort of stylised development path in the way ideas enter and exit. And it's similar to what you learn in philosophy of science about the way paradigm conflict occurs, and the way the generative paradigms hang on, in Lakatosh's terminology, to even though they're bereft of all explanatory power, they still can maintain dominance for a period of time through the groupthink processes. And so the patterns are that initially when a new idea comes along, it's totally disregarded and ignored. It's not a threat, it's just disregarded. And we started working on our project in the early 90s, and have basically been ignored for maybe 20 years. Totally ignored. The second stage is when hostility starts to become visible, but there's no real engagement. And an example of this, I was on a panel in about 2003 or 4, something like that. And I was a keynote speaker, and then the discussant got up, and without engaging at all with what I said, I've only got a short statement to make. We've been visited by a man from Mars today. Everyone laughed their heads off. He proceeded to sit down, and that was the engagement. None. But that was the hostility vilification stage, the put-down stage, the humiliation stage. And then the third stage is that the ideas start to get some currency through whatever means, and then there's a threat perceived, and then engagement starts, which reinforces that hostility, but it's an engaged hostility. And that's where criticism becomes much more targeted. Some of the manifestations of that criticism is, oh, we knew all this all along. There's nothing new about this. We knew it all along. And at some point, and certainly in our research program, it becomes a self-evident truth. That we knew it all along becomes an acceptance of the idea. And that's when the paradigm shift occurs. So I want to talk about that sort of process and our experience and what it is that we are doing that's part of this process. So imagine we're at a Post Keynesian Conference just like this one, back in the 90s, beginning of our project. And I'm having this conversation with a Post Keynesian economist. He's probably several embedded in there, but they're all leading lights in the discipline. And they're very non-mainstream in their own self-representation. And, you know, some of the things I hear during the conversation are, oh, well, you know, interest rates are, and don't take me on historical accuracy there because I can't really think of all that word, but, oh, interest rates are very low at the moment. Government should be borrowing heaps and building public infrastructure and advancing employment. And so I say, yeah, why does the interest rate regime matter? They then say, oh, aren't those neo-classical economists stupid? They haven't understood that crowding out can't occur because we've got access to global markets now and there's endogenous money, so banks can create money, there's no finite savings. Yeah. And then I might have said, oh, but don't you understand the way in which fiscal deficits work through the banking system? And they sort of blank. And fiscal deficits incurred in the downturn are great because they help offset non-government non-spending. But they should be balanced in the upturn. They should be offsetting the upturn. Government should be saving in the upturn. They use terms like saving in the upturn. And I say, yeah, but isn't savings what households do when they're not consuming? And these things will become meaningful soon. And then they'd say, oh, aren't those neoclassical economists stupid? Public borrowing isn't a problem as long as R's less than G. In other words, public debt ratio is stable. I say, what does it matter what the public debt ratio is? They think I matter. And then they say, well, haven't you read James O'Connor? We get on to talking about fiscal choices of government, and they say, haven't you read James O'Connor? He knew 20 years ago, remember in 1990, James O'Connor wrote in the early 70s, there's a fiscal crisis of the state now. We're being limited in our progressive program because our tax bases are shrinking and we can't do what we want to do because of this fiscal crisis of the state. And they say, and the state's being compromised. And I say, what by? Globalisation, they say. How does that compromise the state? Oh, if the state doesn't do what the big fund managers want, there'll be a currency crisis because of capital flight. And I say, well, how can capital really fly? And then another conversation is, well, we've got this inflation problem emerging and we need to batten down the supply side. How do you do that? Oh, we'll have an incomes policy. That's inflation control. We can have progressive stimulus as long as we batten it down with an incomes policy. And another statement might be, well, God, you're advocating large public sector job creation. How are we going to afford that? And then, unfortunately, and let's say we're a bit later because of 2003, something like that, a conference and Robert Lucas Jr. has just given his presidential address to the association. And I had the unfortunate experience of encountering a new Keynesian who I avoid like a plague typically. And the new Keynesian says, well, look, everything of interest is explained in our three-equation model built on micro-optimizing principles. An IS curve, a Phillips curve and a interest rate rule. And I say, me, yeah, but there's no financial sector, there's no banks. And then I'm told, I'm given a quick lecture on efficiency market theory. And then I'm told, well, markets are efficient. I say, yeah, but there's no unemployment in your model even. Because the Phillips curve specifications typically are in output terms, not unemployment. And then I'm told, oh yeah, but the business cycle is dead. And then I'm given a discussion about the great moderation, that it's all solved, and you know, the big macroeconomic questions of the day are solved. The only thing government should now be concerned about is deregulation. So both of those conversations, in my view, reflect the orthodoxy both in the Post Keynesian area and in the new Keynesian, the mainstream. And I don't believe they're straw persons. So let's motivate that. Sometime later the GFC occurs. And my understanding of the GFC is that it demonstrated the complete poverty of the mainstream approach. In my view, the mainstream approach has no further credibility. It never had it anyway, but it should be openly obvious it has no credibility. And all these ad hoc changes to their new Keynesian macro models to fit the financial sector back in. The thing about new Keynesian models is that they're derived in such a way to be mathematically tractable and to be based upon their optimising principles. But of course then they can't explain any real world data. So then they chuck a few ad hoc assumptions in which immediately to fit the data, which immediately violate their claim to be built on micro-optimising principles. It's just bereft of any credibility. And their ad hoc additions of the financial sector are just more of that same. But also, relevant to this audience, is that I think the GFC also exposed major deficiencies in the way post-Keynesians do macro. That's the other point. It's not just an attack on the mainstream. And one of the really significant parts of and I'm talking here about the small group of people that started off this, and I'm talking about Warren, Mosler, Randy Ray, Catalina, I'll get confused with the surname, but we know who Catalina is there, Stephanie Bell, now Carlton, and myself. The small group, Scott came along soon after. One of the things that really we talked about a lot at that time, and we're talking, by the time that group was around, it was the mid-90s, a bit later maybe, I think the first meeting was 96, I can't quite remember, is that the developments in the financial sector as a result of deregulation was likely to lead to a major crisis. That really motivated us thinking about that. Long before we're talking a decade at least before the crisis. And then we set about building more and more of the approach. And in recent years, that approach is increasingly entering the popular discourse. There's no doubt about that. In part because of new technologies. And I remember we were having a meeting, I think there was Randy, Warren and myself, if I'm correct. And I announced really excited, I said, I'm going to start a blog. And Randy just looked at me as if I was mad. What the hell? And I think that, the blog now the social media has allowed us to reach a very wide audience, not just of our peers in academic life, but in activists. And it's really spread and become quite, he's got his hand up. And many people, I think, are now seeing that the core ideas that we've been developing are actually a way in which to fill the void that they feel is left there by the bereftness of both the existing approaches. which are mainstream neo-Keynesian, new Keynesian and post-Keynesian, the extant post-Keynesian literature. But the increasing popularity has also brought all the criticism. We're now getting openly targeted, whereas we've been ignored for years. There's now engagement of a negative type. And that engagement, that critical engagement, is coming not just from mainstream, but also from our own tribe, if you like, post-Keynesian economists who are attacking us. And the criticisms range from, well, there's nothing new in this literature that's now millions of words big. Nothing new at all. We knew this all along. Anything they've got to say, we can subsume and understand from standard existing frameworks. And, you know, there's some out there who say we can understand all this in existing ISLM frameworks. Well, no, you can't, but that's what we'll talk about. Some people say what is claimed to be new is wrong, and what is correct about what we say we knew all along. And the other sort of subsidiary criticism that's starting to come out, both from post-Keynesians one and a number of new Keynesians, is that, these characters use no formal models, therefore it's not knowledge and not robust. Now, the criticism's not exactly true, but even if it was true, then they would have disregarded Marx and Keynes, for example, as being zero knowledge on that basis. So let me talk about just 4 things tonight, because we haven't got a decade. We've just got about 35 or 40 minutes. 4 things that are of interest that I think are novelties, that is, new things, that new understandings, new knowledge that wasn't in the literature prior to our project beginning, that we've contributed and really are core NMT ideas. The first one relates to the Phillips curve. The second one relates to central bank operations and the way in which the central bank and the Treasury departments work, and it could be Ministry of Finance, depending on which country you come from, but we're in America, so we'll call it Treasury today. And one of the really big contributions is what I call exposing the veil of ideology. I'll talk about that. The third novelty is to advance an understanding of, in very finely grained detail, what I call fiscal deficit and debt dynamics. And that allows us to understand, how to reconfigure an understanding of inflation risk, big macro issues like crowding out, and in a way that's never been discussed before. And the fourth thing is the embrace of developments in other social sciences, because remember, typically, economists have the worst cross-citation rate of all the social sciences. And one of the things that I think we've contributed is bringing in other disciplines, and in this case, cognitive linguistics, and the way in which language and framing is important to develop economic understandings and narratives. Okay, so the rest of the talk is briefly to explicate each of those things, some in more detail than others, and that'll be it. So think about where we were in the early 90s in terms of understanding inflation and Phillips curves. And I say Phillips curves because the Phillips curve framework is a centrepiece of all the macro theories. I mean, the standard sort of simplified new Keynesian model has 3 equations, one of which is the Phillips curve. And so it's not just a side issue in the way our profession engages in discussing inflation. And the mainstream Phillips curve approach was what we can simplify as just a neighbour approach. There's debates about the value of the coefficient on the price expectations term, whether it's 1 or not, whether it's temporally different, that is, whether it can be a little bit less than 1 and then 1 once staggered wage contracts adjust, all that sort of stuff. But that's the framework, the framework. And you know, at the extreme end of that school of thought, no trade-off sort of vertical arguments and a complete denial of the real capacity of fiscal policy to do anything that is real, not rather than nominal. This is what I would say would be, at that time, a typical post-Keynesian commentary on the state of the Phillips curve theory. Tom Pally was often writing about the Phillips curve, and he was one of the few post-Keynesians that did write a lot about it. And this was really, you can criticise it if you like. I think this is fairly representative of where post-Keynesians were at the time. And I've marked the blue, the traditional monetary and fiscal policy have an impact, a quantity impact, but yield no inflation benefit. And this is when you've got wages and markups that are exogenous, that are determined through a conflictual process over distribution claims. And that the only way in which you can pursue expansionary policy in such a Phillips curve space is if you have an incomes policy. And if Phillips curves have been sort of my thing for years, and I'm always told that we need, by post-Keynesians, that we need an incomes policy. That's the standard post-Keynesian framework in my view. This idea that we've got to batten down the supply, to have any expansionary space, we've got to batten down the supply curve with an incomes policy. The way in which modern monetary theory is constructed, that this idea of price stability, is to say that a currency issuing government has two choices. It can either run an unemployment buffer stock, which is the neighbour approach, and use unemployment to discipline the distributional struggle, or it can alternatively run an employment buffer stock. So the common element here is the use of buffer stocks. And the way in which we conceive of the neighbour approach as a price anchor, so we introduce that terminology, is that it spends on what we call a quantity rule. That is, the government sets a quantity of spending that it's budgeting and spends according to that, and whether that's consistent with full employment spending levels will show up in the size of the unemployment. This is the unemployment buffer. Whereas we specifically now call it the job guarantee. When I first started doing this in 1978, I started talking about buffer stock employment models. And of course then some cows got sick in England and we couldn't call it the BSC anymore. So my American confrères not being gender specific, we're calling it the ELR. And the ELR, the employment last resort. And that seemed offensive to me, even though I understood that it was an analogue with the lender of last resort capacity of the central bank. That seemed offensive to me because the central bank's dealing with money, inanimate object, and we're dealing here with humans, which is mostly very animate. And so we all agreed, I think, to call it the job guarantee. And the job guarantee had been terminology had been used earlier by others. And and I'm not going to talk in detail about all of the literature on this we've done. I'm just introducing it as the novelty. But our conclusion was that the NAIRU is a very costly inflation anchor whereas the neighbour, the non-accelerating inflation buffer employment ratio, is a superior inflation anchor. And that's core MMT. And I've had lots of criticism through email and counterblogs saying, well, look, most of your MMT ideas are great, but you just got to ditch the job guarantee. It's just peripheral. Well, it's not peripheral, it's the core part of our inflation anchor. You've only got one of two options. Do you want to go the no route, which is the mainstream of existing, or do you want to go a superior inflation anchor? And let me be very clear, the idea of public sector job creation isn't new. We're not claiming that. The idea of the right to work debate is centuries old. They were debating it in the 14th and 15th century. That's not new. That's not our contribution. The use of buffer stocks to control prices is new. And to where I got the idea in 1978 was I was doing an agricultural economics course as a fourth year student at Melbourne University. And the topic of the day was the wool price stabilisation scheme run by the Australian government, where the Australian government would buy up would do a deal with all the farmers to fix their incomes, stabilise their incomes over the year. And then if there was too much wool produced, they took out the market pressure by buying all the wool. And all around Australian cities were these big brick buildings full of wool, a buffer stock of wool. And when the season wasn't as good, so the price didn't go beyond their agreed price, they'd sell out of the wool stores the buffer. That's where I got the idea, and I wasn't the slightest bit interested in wool. But it was full employment of wool, I thought. If the market, to stabilise the price, if it couldn't be bought or sold into the market, the supply, then the government could use the buffer. And at that time in Australia, unemployment was starting to rise in the stagflationary period, late 70s. And that became an idea that you could run a full employment program using a buffer stock. That's where the idea came from myself. Now, Warren later, quite independently, before I even knew him, had already worked that out too. Warren Mosley, that is. And so it's not the use of buffer stocks, it's the introduction of buffer stocks into a Phillips curve framework that's new. And what we've shown, the modern monetary theory has shown, is that for the first time, a currency issuing government can run a buffer stock employment scheme and stabilise inflation by buying on a price rule. In other words, you set a fixed job guarantee wage and you declare an unconditional willingness to buy whatever comes in at that idle labour comes in at that fixed price. And if there's inflationary pressures in the non-government sector, then the process redistributes resources from the inflating sector to the fixed price sector, and eventually you'll stabilise. And very significantly, I think, the Phillips curve in this environment then disappears, because what we end up with is a dot in inflation unemployment space. Now, if you appreciate the significance of the Phillips curve in the macro literature, then this innovation in knowledge and logic is very novel. Some other important parts of this story is that if you think back to the 60s and then on, one of the really big, and starting, the monetarists and these characters, one of the things that they used to disabuse policymakers of active fiscal policy were things like timing lags. That by the time the fiscal authority had operationalised its stimulus, the private sector spending cycle was improving again, and the fiscal policy then became pro-cyclical rather than the design counter-cyclical. Well, what the job guarantee is an automatic stabiliser. because it's a capacity that's in place at all times. It's not a program that's budgeted for. It's an unconditional job offer. And it goes up and down with the private cycle, the non-government cycle. So it's an automatic stabiliser that needs some planning to make sure that there's work that can be created quickly. But it doesn't need any legislative process to debate how much money is going to be spent and whether it's going to be spent and holding up in upper houses and all the rest of the political gymnastics that quite often cruelly effectiveness of normal fiscal innovation. Back to that post-Keynesian conversation, the post-Keynesian mainstream of the day always advocated, if you had unemployment, we needed public investment spending. It's what I call a generalised expansion. Well, if you think about a generalised expansion, there's no inflation anchor built into that because it's buying everything at market prices. The job guarantee buys off the bottom of the market because the fixed wage becomes the minimum wage, whatever you want, whatever the minimum wage, the social standards that you're aspiring to become. You could set the minimum wage above the existing private sector wage and drive low wage private firms out of business if you wanted to. That's a political and social choice. The other thing about the job guarantee is it becomes spatially calibrated. You can actually, it's available anywhere. So you don't get this tension between the economic settlement and the social settlement, which is one of the real problems in societies where regional areas are hollowing out because the work's gone, and a lot of regional centres are just becoming geriatric places where old people are just dying and their children are gone. But the last thing I'll say about this point here is that it's not just a job guarantee, a job creation scheme. A lot of people say to me, oh, that's just an elaborate job creation scheme. Well, it sort of is, obviously, because it's an unconditional job offer. But for MMT, it's a macroeconomic stabilisation framework because embedded in it is the inflation anchor. And we've never held out that it's the solution to everything. But it's the minimum that a currency issuing government should put in place as a responsibility, because we were having this conversation earlier, that one of the major change that occurs when you go into a state money system, the one big change from a barter to a state fiat currency system is that you've got to get people to use your currency. And that requires you impose taxes to create a demand for the currency. Another NMT idea. And as soon as you create a tax, that's tantamount to creating unemployment. Because you're creating a demand for that currency and people are willing to offer services. And if you don't meet that demand for spending, at least as much as the taxation, then there will be mass unemployment. Okay, moving on quickly. The second area where I said there was novelty was in discussions about central banks and treasuries. And what the criticism in the literature now is, it's emerging and becoming amplified because more and more people are jumping on this claim, is that we live in a fiction, MMTs live in a fictional world, that we've made up this world and all of our propositions are just a reflection of this fiction we've created. And they point out that, well, governments can't spend first, which they say is an MMT statement. They say, what MMT says is that a currency issuing government is never financially constrained intrinsically in its spending. It can buy whatever is available for sale in its own currency. That's what MMT says. The criticism then says, well, no, it can't. That's a fiction. And what they point out to is, they say because another point about MMT is we start off with a consolidated central bank and treasury as a government sector. We consolidate those two functions. And there's good reason to do that. There's pragmatic reasons, because if you know how those institutions operate on a daily basis, you'll know that the central bank and the treasury are in constant contact in the mornings, because they have to be. If the central bank is the operations desks are engaged in liquidity management so that they can maintain their target policy rate. And the treasury, of course, or the finance ministries know what's going on in terms of outflows and inflows related to fiscal policy. And of course, they've got to coordinate and synchronise them so that the central bank can maintain its liquidity management. So of course they've got to work together intrinsically. But I'll come back to that. And of course, it's pointed out in the literature saying, well, these MMTs, don't they know that there's independent central banks? Don't they know that there's all these fiscal and accounting rules like tax and loan accounts in America and other accounting structures in different countries? Don't they know that there's got to be money in these accounts before the government before the central bank will allow the governments to spend out of them? Don't they know that? And these criticisms, when they first started to emerge, they implicitly assumed we're dogs. They're unbelievable. That as if these characters have never thought about this. And some years before these criticisms started to emerge, around 2011 these criticisms started to emerge, some years before that, I'd written an article outlining the role of these voluntary constraints that governments and these accounting structures that governments put in place. And as an aside, one of the characteristics of a lot of these criticisms is that the critic has never really read discloses the fact by omission rather than admission, that they haven't actually read all the primary literature. There's these sort of critics building on critics, and so MMT position becomes what the last critic said it was. And so the way to think about the consolidation of the Treasury and the central bank, which is core MMT, with the fact that, of course, there's all of these voluntary constraints and accounting procedures and rules and regulations about the way governments spend and not. Of course there's that. The way to think about this is, the way I think about it, and I'll explain it, is through my understanding of Marx. And one of the great things that I learned when I was a young boy, reading Capital and Wage and Labour and all of these other documents that Marx had written, was that this exposition of the superficiality of exchange relations to understand the intrinsic nature of the capitalist mode of production. You can't view it from the level exclusively of the exchange relationships. The so-called wage form is highly misleading. The idea that you get $8 an hour for 8 hours a day leads, if you take that literally at a superficial level, leads you to think that the worker is getting paid for 8 hours of production. That's the wage form. It hides the reality of the capitalist production process. And so Marx said, obviously you've got to dig down underneath this superficial level. And the early Marxian critics of neoclassical economics made this point very clearly. The classic statement is Samuel Bruton in 1968, who was the editor of Financial Times, I think, at the time, saying, well, to understand the labour market, it's just like the market for bananas. Well, no, it's not. Because in the market for bananas, the exchange relationships, the use values and the exchange values are separated. The transactions exchanged and the The banana seller takes the income and the banana guy leaves the exchange and eats the banana. Guy being not gender specific. Whereas in the labour market, you don't sell labour in the labour market exchange, you sell labour power. And of course the labour is extracted while the exchange is still in place, not after you go home from work. And so it was to me that was a great contribution of Marx to really explain the origins of profit and the misleading nature of the wage form and the superficiality of exchange relations. And it was a very powerful piece of analysis because then the riots began, because workers realised they were being dudded. Well, think about that, and this is how I explain the way MMT operates. We have two levels of reality. One level is the actual institutional practices with their intended voluntary constraints that governments have put in place to regulate their own behaviour. They're totally voluntary. They vary depending upon the ideology of the day. So, for example, in the early 1980s, the Australian government used to run a TAP bond issuing system where they would announce a yield they were prepared to pay, say 5%, and they would say they want to borrow 20 billion Australian dollars at 5% fixed yield. And they'd turn the tap on depending upon the bond dealers would then come in and they'd buy whatever they wanted. And if they judged that the fixed yield was not competitive relative to their options, they mightn't buy any. Who'd buy the rest? The central bank would. And once neoliberalism came along, that was deeply offensive to them. And so they went to an auction system where the private sector, the bond dealers, determine the yield as the last bid that absorbs the bid, the tender. And the head of the Australian Financial Management, Office of Financial Management, which is a division of Treasury that manages debt issuance, was openly explicit. He said this puts a discipline on government because they know that debt is politically charged. So these institutional arrangements are ideology and they fluctuate. So, and the second level of reality, which is the level that MMT has exposed, is the intrinsic nature of the monetary system. What the stripped away from the politics and the ideology, what are the intrinsic nature of this system? And so when you're thinking about the second level of analysis, you won't find that in the mainstream texts and you won't find it in the extant Post Keynesian texts. That's our contribution. And the first level up there is the world of politics and ideology. And so by having a level of analysis that conflates the central bank and the Treasury and exposes the intrinsic nature of the monetary system, we're really showing that these voluntary constraints provide a veil of ideology that is essentially undemocratic because it hides the reality of the system and makes it look as though the government can run out of money. And so when the government doesn't want to deal with 10% unemployment, and it tells the electorate, we can't deal with this because we haven't got enough money, MMT provides citizens with the capacity to know that that's an outright lie. And it forces the public debate then to say, well, why don't you want to spend the currency that you have? You must want that unemployment. And once these ideas permeate, my view is that will change the political debate because the neolibs are going to have to come clean. They'll no longer be able to say, we will run out of money. Okay, moving quickly. The other point also, and this is just a little more detail, many of what look like voluntary constraints are in actual fact what we call reserve maintenance operations. And the example I give here are, and to some extent, the intrinsic nature, those levels that are identified have actually become blurred, because in some cases you can't actually hide the intrinsic nature of the monetary system. And the example I give here are the T&L accounts, and I use that as a US example because I'm in the US today. And the government spending adds to bank reserves. Once the money goes into banking deposits, they show up ultimately in bank reserves. And when the government levies taxes, those taxes drain bank reserves. And so at that point, the T&L funds are shifted to some Treasury account at the central bank. And they have to do that to maintain the desired liquidity in the cash system. And so these synchronised transactions are interpreted by the mainstream as financing operations when they're really just liquidity management operations, because if the Reserve Bank didn't do those, the central bank didn't do those offsetting accounting entries and shifting numbers in accounts, then they'd have an incompatible level of reserves in the banking system, incompatible with its target interest rate. And similarly, debt issuance MMT demonstrates how debt issuance isn't a funding operation. Now, when you think about it, debt issuance is totally nonsensical. After August 1971, or whenever the other nations decided to break with Bretton Woods, and they did it in a sort of staggered way, governments no longer needed to borrow because they were free, their exchange rate responsibilities were free. And what NMT shows is that through these accumulated effects on bank reserves, when the government issues debt, it's really borrowing just passed through deficit. And as a matter of logic, something in the past can't be funded by something in the future. And our early work, and this is before the crisis, was to demonstrate that the only use of government debt was to maintain liquidity management in the banking reserve system. Because if the fiscal deficits push up reserves, and of course excess reserves are not wanted by the commercial banks because they're not going to generate a competitive return. Pre-crisis we're talking. And so in the interbank market, they're trying to get rid of those, and they're trying to lend and find other banks. Because remember, the reserves aren't lent out to anybody else. They're just circulated among the banks that have accounts with the central bank. And of course, that competitive process to try to eliminate excess reserves ends up in driving the interest rate down. And of course, if the central bank's got a 5% target interest rate, that's the policy rate, and there's excess reserves and there's competitive process driving that rate down, of course the central bank then loses control over its monetary policy. And the extreme is that goes like Japan to zero, which was its monetary policy target. And so the way in which the central bank can maintain its liquidity desires in terms of levels of reserves, and therefore maintain its monetary policy stance in the face of continuous fiscal deficits, is to be draining those excess reserves. And how do they drain them? They sell bonds in exchange for reserves. That's not a financing operation, it's a monetary operation. And so in all the textbooks you'll see debt issuance as in the fiscal policy chapter. It's got nothing to do with fiscal policy necessarily, it's a monetary operation. Of course, that need to drain reserves for bond issuance is really unnecessary if you're wanting to pay support rates on excess reserves, which is the current practice. So none of these insights were in the extant economic literature. None. Okay, the third thing, fiscal dynamics and fiscal rules. I'll go quickly now. Warren and Matt Forstater, I forgot to mention that as one of our early group. Apologies if you're in the room. They brought out a very insightful piece of work where they distinguished between what they call vertical transactions within a currency system between a government and a non-government, and horizontal transactions between non-government entities, banks and individuals. This was novel. Why was it novel? Because the implications for the net financial worth of the non-government sector are different depending whether it's a vertical transaction, which could be a government spending, could be a tax hike, central bank buying gold, for example. But let's say government spending and taxation. The implications for the net worth of the non-government sector are quite different to those where there's horizontal transactions occurring. So when the government spends some dollars, the net worth of the financial assets of the non-government sector increase. When it taxes the non-government sector, the financial assets in net terms decline. Whereas when the horizontal transactions don't alter the net financial assets of the non-government sector. They might alter the composition of those assets, but they don't alter the net position. Now, why is that an important point? Well, first of all, if you think to any of the mainstream textbooks, there'll be a chapter on fiscal policy. And it's typically done in an IS-LM framework or an AS-AD framework, doesn't matter. And then students are introduced to the three types of financing for fiscal policy: taxation, debt, money creation, printing money, that's what it's called, even though there's no printing presses or regular money. And then students are entertained, put to sleep in other words, by these elaborate discussions of the different implications for inflation of these different forms of funding. And students are led to believe that if the government sells bonds, that will be less inflationary, but less expansionary, I should have said that the other way around, than if the government has money creation. And so you get these discussions that, well, money creation is eschewed as a taboo because it's going to lead to hyperinflation. Bond issuance is preferred to money creation, but bad because it builds up public debt. And so the best thing is to run fiscal balances. But what MMT has, I believe, demonstrated, which is new, is that type of analytical thinking is totally wrong. That the inflation risk is embedded in the government, any spending. And government spending is always monetisation. All this idea that students learn that some government spending is tax financed, some of it's bond finance, and some of it's the result of money creation. That's not a description of reality. Government spending is all just money creation of reserves. And then what monetary operations might happen coincidentally to that, but not causally, is a separate issue. And that insight then gives you another set of understandings, and that is if you think about the impact of fiscal deficits on the banking system, well, there's no way that there can be financial crowding out. And it's not the Post Keynesian argument that global capital will come along and save the day. It's the fact that the way in which fiscal deficits impact upon the reserve system, as I described before, is to put down pressure on the interest rates. How does that work? It works because fiscal deficits increase reserves. And if those reserves are excess to the commercial banks' projected reserves to satisfy what they think they'll need for the clearing system, well, then they'll try to get rid of those reserves to earn a competitive return. And that competitive process puts downward pressure on the interest rate. Now, it may not drive the interest rate down because that depends on what the central bank does, but it puts downward pressure. And so the idea that the mainstream idea that students learn is that the IS curve shifts and that pushes up the money demand, and depending upon the interest rate and income sensitivity of money demand, interest rates rise as well, and that crowds out other forms of interest rate sensitive spending. That can't be right. And then the post-Keynesian, the sort of mainstream post-Keynesian arguments of the day then used to argue about the slope of the IS curve. And they'd say, well, the crowding out's going to be a minimal problem because the IS curve's steep, and because current investment isn't particularly sensitive to current interest rates. Logically, it really can't be at all sensitive to current interest rates because it's a plan that's taken years ago. As an aside. That's a new insight that wasn't in the existing literature, which is incredibly important insight because it's a major vehicle in the public debate to disabuse us of the use of fiscal policy, that it will damage private investment. Well, rather, what NMT supports is the crowding in type approach. That if the government runs a full employment economy, a robust economy where people have got incomes and wages and spending and jobs, then that will be a very conducive environment for private investment. Okay, this is our finished. So then we get into discussions about what fiscal sustainability is and what the concept of a cost of a policy program is. And if you read mainstream literature and in the policy literature, it comes out from the OECD or the IMF or the World Bank or even UNDP. You've got a website about fiscal sustainability. And you'll read about it all in terms of fiscal space, and it will be all in terms of debt ratios and deficit to GDP ratios, all self-contained logic, as if you can define what a fiscal deficit, the appropriateness of a fiscal deficit by some level of the fiscal deficit. And the implication is that a 2% fiscal deficit of GDP is better than a 5% deficit. Well, what MMT says is that sometimes a deficit of 10% of GDP might be appropriate and sustainable. Sometimes a 2% deficit might be appropriate and sustainable, and sometimes a fiscal surplus might be appropriate and sustainable. And what does it depend upon? It depends upon the relationship between the government spending and the real economy. You can't define fiscal sustainability in a circular way in terms of the balance itself. Some threshold, the Rogoff threshold, 80%, what's that mean? Nothing. And so you've got to define fiscal sustainability in terms of providing sufficient net spending into the economy once the private sector has made its spending and savings decisions, such that all the available resources that want to be utilised are brought into productive use. And that's fiscal sustainability. In other words, the fiscal balance should just be whatever it takes to reach that position. And that's a world apart in conceptualisation and policy insight than you'll see in any mainstream or any post-Keynesian of that era when we started. Because what the post-Keynesians of that era used to say is that deficits are okay when there's a downturn, when you need a stimulus, but they've got to be offset when we're in an upturn to ensure that the debt ratio stays stable. MMT doesn't think that at all. Deficit is effectively an irrelevant number to compute. That's what I do. And the cost of the program, when, you know, this idea of the cost of a program, you know, oh, well, the cost of that particular public expenditure is X number of dollars. And I'm continually being asked, well, what would the cost of a job guarantee be? And what I say is the additional food that the workers will be able to eat, the additional tractors or whatever that's needed to, capital equipment that's needed to accompany the work activity, that's the cost of the program. It's the extra real resources that are needed. Because for a currency issuing government, the only thing that it has to ensure is that the real resources are productively used. The numbers that are put in pieces of paper that are called budgets are irrelevant. That's new, and none of economists don't think like that particularly. Okay, I think I've done enough. And the last thing I won't talk about, because we've got enough, is this use of language. You'll notice I never use the term budget deficit or budget balance. I always talk about fiscal balance. And that's because if you study this literature and learn about how people cognate, that is, learn and acquire knowledge and understandings of their reality, it's through the use of metaphors. And this is the work of Ronald Langford and George Lakoff and others. And it's important as economists, if you want to have a dialogue with, a policy dialogue with citizens, it's important to understand how citizens actually learn and build understandings of their realities. And so language becomes very important because one of the ideological constructs that mainstream economists use is metaphor and language. And you know, and just as the example I gave, that we're continually berated with this idea that the fiscal balance, the budget of the government, is just like the household budget.
Who said that?
Huh?
Who said that?
Barrow said it.
That's not Post Keynesian.
No, some of my criticism about post-Keynesian, some of them about mainstream. Okay? Barrow wrote that. That's a mainstream understanding, and it's used as a metaphor to get us to relate experientially our own circumstances as if they're the same circumstances confronting a government. And of course, the government isn't a big household. We've got financial constraints. The government doesn't have financial constraints. And so the use of language is very important, and I'll leave it there.